Hello, my name is Matthew Pfeiffer. Thank you for joining Toxic to Triumph. I have on a very special guest, a good friend of mine at this point, even though this is our first time talking to each other live. I have Heather Thompson out of Colorado Springs, Colorado. She is a licensed professional counselor. She's a registered play therapist, trauma informed therapist. She works with not only adults who are dealing with trauma and abusive situation, but she also deals with children as well. So we're going to be talking about childhood trauma from an adult's perspective. Also, we're going to be talking about this from a child's perspective with people who are dealing with a toxic or narcissistic partner. And you might be in it and are just kind of curious, how does this impact my children? And obviously that becomes a very big deciding factor on whether I should stay or whether I should go. So, with that being said, thank you, Heather, very much for stopping by. If you can introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. I am Heather Thompson. Also, Hezzy Helps on TikTok. Um, I live obviously in Colorado Springs, Colorado. I own my own private practice. I predominantly work with trauma and attachment, with the foster care system, adult survivors of child abuse and childhood trauma. I also see like private pay clients, things like that, adoptive parents. I teach a trauma informed parenting class as well. I, yeah, that's about it.
I'm talking a lot about ADHD too, now that I think about it.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Well, I talk a lot about ADHD from more of a personal perspective.
Okay. Nothing wrong with that.
Yeah. I do also practice and see kiddos and adolescents and adults with, ADHD or, anxiety, depression, things like that. I'm an EMDR therapist as well. So yeah, I do talk a lot about ADHD, really sharing the things that have helped me in the past. Or in the present too. Yeah. So
you're a true wounded healer then.
Yes. Yes. Because, I am a childhood trauma survivor, not, I've had some childhood trauma, but not relational as far as within the family system per se. And I have ADHD and also a learning difference. I have a processing disorder. So sometimes reading and math and things like that were super hard for me in school. So yeah, I get it.
When speaking of wounded healer, when you hear that from someone and you have an adult that comes in and they may have had undiagnosed ADHD coming in, what does that look like? How do you recognize it?
When I see somebody with undiagnosed ADHD,
yeah,
often what I see is there is this history of struggles all through school, a lot of negative self-beliefs. I'm stupid. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm a disaster. I'm a mess. I can't get things straight. I'm so disorganized. And as we begin to break those things down and look at the symptomology, a lot of times there is co-occurring stuff happening. Like, yes, there might be ADHD and then trauma, childhood trauma. And the symptomology often looks really similar. And so I'm one of those folks that really believes in the continuum of care. And so I am not foolish enough to believe that I'm the end all be all for my client, right? So I have done a lot of networking within my field here in Colorado Springs. I know quite a few evaluators that I could send clients to get a really good evaluation and an understanding of their symptomology and what's going on. I work with some fantastic, actually, psychiatric nurse practitioners that see all ages, that do a lot of holistic work. They look at things at an organic level and work their way up. They even do genetic testing to make sure that if we go the route of meds, if that's needed, that they are getting what is going to, the meds that they are prescribing is going to be the most effective. Occupational therapists, all kind, speech therapists, things like that. I work with someone that teaches trauma-informed yoga. So what I really love to do when I'm working with a client that has lots of symptomology that kind of seems to co-occur is gather a team for them of folks that can be their support system for wellness to help them with their mental health. And then we start tackling and trying to find a way for them to experience some relief from their symptoms. And then I want to assess and treat trauma first, because a lot of times when we peel back that layer of trauma and really tackle it from a physiological level, some of those symptoms that look like ADHD dissolve or are more manageable. And then we might not have to treat the ADHD per se, or it might not have even been ADHD.
Speaking of trauma, you mentioned a couple of times that trauma can have an impact. And at least in your content on TikTok, we both talk about trauma with adults.
Yes.
I think from a different lens, from a different perspective, but it still impacts and still affects both the same. And we both talk about childhood trauma. And I'm sure that you get the same comments and the same DMs that I do, that how did I end up in this relationship? How did I end up in this situation when I didn't have childhood trauma?
Mm-hmm.
And childhood trauma becomes very confusing to people, because if they were not physically hit, or if there were no physical or sexual abuse, there's an assumption that you did not have childhood trauma. And that's not the case. Can you give us kind of your overall view of what is childhood trauma anyway, and how does that impact people? What does it look like if someone says, well, I had great parents and I had loving parents? Like, what is childhood trauma?
Childhood trauma can be anything that a child or infant, extreme stress that was not mitigated, right? That was not buffered by that attuned adult that could co-regulate and soothe the nervous system of the child. That does not mean that you had bad parents. That does not mean that your parents were not doing the best they could. That does not mean that your parents didn't love you. It could mean that your parents were unable to mitigate that stress for you, were unable to be that buffer of that toxic stress that impacts our ability to create that understanding within ourselves that is deep in our implicit memory, that I am safe, and even how to choose a safe partner. We are drawn to some of those same dynamics implicitly. It's not a conscious choice. So there's that. Also, trauma can be a parent with postpartum depression untreated. Mm-hmm. Childhood trauma can be stressful events over time where the parents were unable to be available emotionally for that child. Childhood trauma can be big key events like an earthquake, a tornado, or something like that that went unprocessed. It can be a parent with untreated or undiagnosed borderline personality disorder, bipolar disorder, any type of mental health issue that goes untreated or unacknowledged, because it is huge as an adult or a parent to make that big step and say, I'm struggling and I need help and support. And there's also people that are adults now. We have to be aware that 20 years ago mental health was very stigmatized, and 20 years ago we know a lot more now about brain development, childhood development, parenting, attachment. We know so much more now than we did 10 years ago. We know so much more now than we did 20 years ago.
Are you saying that 10 and 20 years ago, there weren't therapists like you and I doing TikTok dances, teaching people about
exactly
trauma? Yeah.
Right. And we weren't talking about it, right? Mm-hmm. We were, have a stiff upper lip, don't talk about it. We don't talk about that. There's this that contingency plan of family secrets, right? We don't talk about that mommy can't cope and she cries at night and I hear her. We don't talk about that. We don't talk about what happens what happened with Uncle so-and-so. We don't talk about that. Hush, hush. That didn't happen. Also, children were to be seen and not heard as well. Also, some of the kind of tried and true or traditional parenting styles actually really were hurtful and
Can you give an example?
Teach spanking, right?
Right.
A lot of folks, a lot of millennials, Gen Zers, the silent generation, and definitely boomers were raised on that was how we disciplined. We put you in your nose to the corner, we shamed you, and we spanked you. And then you got your shit together. Right?
And what would happen as a result of that? Where does that with so many people as adults, how does spanking impact you as an adult?
Well, because number one, spanking does not teach a child how to regulate their emotional stress, right? When they are in distress emotionally and then you spank them, that does not help them regulate. And so it's this continued pattern of you become dysregulated, you become frustrated, angry, overwhelmed, sad, you want attention, you're confused, you get spanked. And so then that pattern and then it builds right over time. And so we can't regulate our emotions. We get disrupted. And then our first response to disruption is anger and aggression. And then that pattern continues.
Can you talk a little bit more about trauma in adults? What does it look like? For me, most of the people that I deal with, their trauma shows up in their interpersonal relationships with their romantic partners, with their in the dating scene, at work, self-sabotaging behavior at work. Can you talk a little bit more about like it, for people who are listening that might be hearing some of this childhood trauma and like that, she's describing my life. That's, I was spanked growing up. My parents, my mom or my dad was a narcissist, or, I grew up in a domestic violent home. How does that show up? Because a lot of times people think that because they have a job or because they've been married for a long time, that it's not showing up, and then they're in denial. What does it look like as an adult?
Right. Yes, I hear that a lot. Like, I have all these degrees and I have a job and I have a car and I pay my mortgage and I'm
All the
doing
highlights.
fine.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm doing great. But we see it in a lot of ways, right? Because there's a lot of these implicit dynamics that we're unaware of. So one of those things is that deep integrated shame and it deep in our self-esteem and in our ego. So we have different responses to correction, right? Or perceived rejection. So we are criticized or corrected, and we go either we disconnect and we go deep down and we silence that person, right? And we give them the cold shoulder, or we come after them, or we try to take them down a notch. We do a lot of, talking about people and getting involved in drama because that's our homeostasis, right? That's what we're used to. We do a lot of negative self-talk and self-beliefs, beating ourselves up. There's a lot of shame involved. A lot of times our response to shame is either to beat ourselves up or beat the other person up that we feel is creating that uneasy, that discomfort inside of us. There was something else I was just thinking that I wanted to say too. We also have either deep struggle with intimacy. We can, and I'm talking about that ability to connect in a vulnerable, healthy way with another individual. So we have a really thick intimacy barrier between us and other people, between us and our partner. We have an inability to really pick a safe partner or safe relationships. We choose unsafe relationships because that's what we know, or
Because that's what's most comfortable.
Yes, because that's homeostasis. That's the norm.
Right.
So something safe feels uncomfortable to you. Or we choose somebody that we can fix or caretake because that's the norm, right? Because we're the fixer. We can swoop in and be everything to everybody, right?
People pleasing, right?
Yep. We become, and that's the other thing too, at the expense of ourself. That was the next place I was going to go, is at the expense to ourself, we become an appeaser. We become that and a lot of people like to call them the peacekeepers or the fawns, or, we become that person that will do whatever it takes to keep the status quo, to keep everybody happy at the expense of ourselves. And that is so sad and tragic to that wounded person. I think I covered a lot of it.
What's it like when an adult comes to you and they discover that this has been their reality for, let's say that they're 45 years old, and they have realized that since childhood they've been living this life of this fawn or people pleasing and allowing for people to completely take advantage of them, and they haven't really been living this authentic life that they may have thought that they did. I imagine that it becomes very jarring for them.
Yes, and often it really takes that building of the therapeutic relationship first, right? To where I can be, and I kind of like try to in doses instead of just like feeding them from the fire hose and being like, guess what?
Right.
They have those little tiny light bulb moments a little bit at a time, especially when we talk about or when they fill out my form for their social history. And a lot of times I like to start with developing relationship with them, doing some psychoeducation around the brain-body connection and how early experiences impact our dynamics now and how we regulate and how we perceive the world and ourself in it. And then little bit at a time, they have these light bulb moments of, whoa, whoa, whoa. And then what I say often is, I like for people to understand the why first, because then they're more invested in the how.
Yep.
We're going to get to healing.
Yep.
So when they begin to understand the why, then we're able to go deep down and start from the bottom of the brain up, get them engaged in activities that will help heal their nervous system. And then we begin with the implicit memory and work our way up to the explicit memory and the memories that they really truly remember. Often stuff resurfaces into their explicit memory that they have buried because of that. Nobody wants to say, hey, yeah, my parents could have done a better job, or hey, yeah, I messed up, or whatever. We don't want to. That's hard. That's really hard work. And then also giving that space and that awareness of, this is it. This takes time. We're only going to do this in baby steps. You don't need to feel rushed here.
Does everyone have childhood trauma?
No, I don't believe everybody does, because here's what I believe. There are some. Now, everybody has experienced stress. Everybody has experienced potentially traumatic events. Apps 100%. Everybody's experienced events that could be traumatic. However, you may have this, what I call the resiliency factor in your DNA, right? Pretty decent family system, a good enough family system, right? We are all not going to fuck up our kids. Right? So a good enough parent, a good enough family system, a good enough attachment with said parent who is a good enough buffer for stress, right? So you have those components already built into your DNA. And then you had that a few adults that were able to see you were struggling, and they were your champion. They came alongside you and supported you and helped you process that experience. And I used this. Now, my kid does have childhood trauma because he had medical trauma. But because I'm a therapist, I was able to get him in therapy and yada, yada, yada. But I'm going to talk about not his medical trauma, but I'm going to talk about an experience that he had when he was about 3. And I told this story with TikTok Teach as well with Chaz. He went and had to receive some shots, and we had a horrible nurse. I mean, it was obvious that she was burnt out, frustrated. My kid has sensory processing disorder. He was already struggling. And he's had some medical trauma. So when we are in a medical setting, he gets anxious already. And so I was trying to let her know, look, you're going to have to, take it easy on him. He's anxious. And she was just really rough with him, just, and did it, and just was really harsh and scared him. And so then, And what I should have done as his parent is I should have said, you know what? No, I don't want you, but it happened all so fast. And I was even like, I couldn't even like keep a coherent thought really. And I'm a therapist, right? What I wished I would have done would have been to say, you know what? No, I don't want you touching my kid. Get out of here. But it happened so fast that I just like my mama bear hadn't surfaced yet. And at that time, I was still kind of at the end of processing my own experience with his birth and the trauma that had created. And so I think I was almost kind of frozen too. And so what happened afterwards was beautiful. And we'll explain why I believe that everybody has experienced traumatic events, but do they carry that into adulthood? No, because this is what happened with me and my kiddo. Each day for the next about 3 months, and it became less and less, he would get his little doctor's kit and he would bring it over to me and he would tell me, I want to play doctor. And I would say, okay. And he would, at first, he was the nurse and I was the patient. No, other way around. At first, I was the nurse and he was the patient, and I would give him the shot and da 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 da. And then he would be like, now you be my mom, and I would be myself. And it got to a place where I was able to say, buddy, I wish that I would have done this. No, you are not giving my kid a shot, and I would protect him from the nurse. And we played that and played that and played that. And then he empowered himself to become the nurse, and he did it the right way. He was gentle to me and kind and loving. And that hurt a little bit, but I'm okay. But you know what? If I wasn't going to be nice, your mom would have, come in and told me to go away. So he processed it and processed it and processed it, made sense of it until he felt okay about the event.
Is that the key to healing childhood trauma? Processing the event and then validating those events and then recreating what the new narrative should be?
Yes.
Is that true of adults as well?
Yes. Yes. And two, really, the therapeutic relationship is often one of your first experiences with a healthy relational dynamic. And sometimes it even mirrors what that parent-child relationship, having that bigger, stronger, wiser, regulated, thoughtful, caring container to hold your stress, to hold your pain, to validate your feelings.
I hear people say, hold space. I'm going to hold space for you, that sort of thing. Yeah.
Yes. And those changes and that healing, we often expect it to be happening, for it to happen in, like, take this pill and, you're healed,
Yeah.
And that's not how this type of healing is experienced.
Right.
It is experienced in small doses over time, in repetition.
Speaking of which, you say often that it's your catchphrase, and I've adopted it whenever I talk to people, that it's the big people's job to take care of the little people.
Yeah.
I'm hearing a lot of people listening to this, and I can just imagine that their next question is, how do I prevent childhood trauma within my child? In particular, because most people listening to this show are in or are healing from a toxic, in particular, narcissistically abusive relationship. So their children are either experiencing trauma currently, or they have experienced trauma. So for our little people out there, how do we make sure that we protect them from this? Because you and I talked about this off camera, where or before we recorded, that the court system is designed to protect the rights of parents.
Right.
So even though for people who are being emotionally abusive, they're still going to have access to their children, whether it be 50-50 every Thursday or every other weekend or whatever the case is. And so the children are being re-traumatized on people's off week. Can you talk a little bit more about children who are currently children and what to do about those type of situations?
Right, exactly. And yes, we were talking about that because often we want this ideal scenario of either I'm going to stay because two parents is better than one, but two unhealthy parents are not better than one. So let's dispel that myth. It only takes one good enough healthy parent to be a buffer for stress for your children. Another thing is, well, but how do I co-parent with this person, right? And I don't want them to be, I want this perfect scenario of I get full custody.
Mm-hmm.
That most likely is not going to happen because our court system is, number one, most judges don't want to hear about emotional abuse. They don't want to hear about that. There's no evidence. It's not in black and white.
Mm-hmm.
They don't listen to that.
And to be fair, one of the things I like to bring up, to be fair, when we're talking about narcissists and people who are very manipulative, they will spin that right back on you.
Yep,
and so we have got to be
absolutely.
careful with that, because they will make it sound, and it will be very convincing that you are the one that's manipulative and that you're the one
Yes.
that. And so we have to understand it from the court's perspective,
Yep.
that they are also there to protect you from those same scenarios as well.
Exactly. And the court system is, it has to be black and white, right? Because you can't operate in abstracts in court. So the result that we are hopeful for is that we don't have to force our kids to go, spend time with our abuser. It's not going to happen. The courts are also set up for the comfort and convenience of adults, not children.
Right.
It's unfortunate, but that's just the way it is.
Right.
And so we're going to be asking our children to transition often. However, that shouldn't deter you from getting out of an abusive situation. And here is why. Once you are out of that abusive situation, you are going to be, believe it or not, and it's going to be hard and it's going to be hell going through that whole process. And I don't want to candy coat that at all because it's terrible.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other side of that, and that's why you got to gather a support system, gather a team of people that can help and support you. On the other side of that, you are going to have some relief. You are going to not be constantly hyper-vigilantly aware of not disrupting or tossing or this person that is your abuser, because your kiddos are regulating to your nervous system, especially if you are their attachment figure, which you most likely are, because it's narcissists don't attach to anybody.
I just want to reiterate something that you just said, that they are attaching to your nervous system.
Yes.
And one of the biggest things that I talk to with people I work with, and I talk about it, I talk about in content with, on TikTok and other platforms, you feel like you're walking on eggshells in these type of relationships. That is your nervous system. So you can just imagine what your children are experiencing and what they are attaching to.
Right. And they have a weaker, less developed nervous system and brain. And so all of this wiring and connections are happening while they're regulating to your hypervigilance, and this sense of not being safe. And so on the other side of the divorce and getting out of that situation, you will be able to work on yourself and settle your nervous system and become that buffer for stress for your children.
Absolutely. And so you essentially self-love, setting boundaries and taking care of yourself and making sure that you're safe. If you're good, your kids will be good.
Absolutely.
You become the buffer. You take care of yourself. You heal yourself. And with that, and I know we do have to wrap up, but before we let you go, can you just give us some highlights on, because I know you talk about CPTSD the way that I do, and just talk briefly about how do you heal from it? What is it? Just some quick highlights on CPTSD.
Sure. And that's a good to piggyback on, right? Because often folks that are healing from being in a narcissistic relationship often have a component of childhood trauma or PTSD from that, or complex trauma is in the mix. And that is one of the other reasons why when somebody has left that type of scenario, the parents' healing, the parents' treatment is my priority. People often want to get the kids in therapy, get the kids in therapy, get the kids in therapy. Your narcissistic partner is going to probably sabotage that. They can't sabotage your treatment, though. So when I am working with somebody with complex trauma, my priority is to start at a physiological level, because most often there is a relational component. So there is an attachment or multiple attachment wounds. And then there is damage and woundings to your nervous system that we need to tackle first. And we can't process the trauma and we can't process those attachment wounds until your nervous system is ready to do that. And so we look at a lot of things like, breath work, and I try to find things that fit for that particular individual. I'm a more individualized, I seek an individualized treatment for that client. So whatever it is, I do a lot of sand tray work because that is not verbal. You're really not using words. You're using more pictures, and it's a sensory experience. Dance and movement, trauma-informed yoga, breath work, exercise, whatever is going to, create that healing in the bottom of the brain, sensory experiences, being out in nature.
I was just about to say, literally is just about to say, what about getting out in nature? That's a big one for me.
Being out in nature, mindfulness. But here's the thing. I think a lot of folks feel overwhelmed when therapists begin to talk about things like mindfulness, breath work, yoga, things like that, because they are like, I tried it and I couldn't do it, or I tried it and it didn't work for me. Often with complex trauma, being present in your body is weird. It doesn't feel right. It almost feels so overwhelmingly uncomfortable that you want to avoid it at all costs. And that's why I say baby steps so often. So we might start with being aware of your brain and your body and how your breath or grounding in 30-second intervals. or 15-second intervals,
Mm-hmm.
instead of expecting you to listen or practice this 30-minute meditation,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because that, I think that sometimes is that misconception.
Yep.
Often I read a book about mindfulness that's for children
Mm-hmm.
to adults, because it's a way to give a baby step and also nurture an adult in a way that they might not have never been nurtured before.
Mm-hmm.
We talk about just awareness of our surroundings, awareness of a fidget and how that feels, awareness of the sand and the sand tray and what that's like.
Mm-hmm.
And so we take those doses, right? Little baby steps, a little bit at a time, to become aware of our nervous system and then begin to heal it in ways that work for that client. And then we move up to more midbrain type work, relational type work, healing attachment, maybe some EMDR or some DBT or sensory motor psychotherapy, things like that. And then move up and up and up, and then talk about, talk deeper about creating boundaries and things like that.
Heather, we could talk literally for days. I have a feeling.
Yeah.
All of this was very, very informative. We are definitely 100% going to have to do this again. For people, I do know that you're full. So for people who would like Heather to be your therapist or your child's therapist, that's not going to happen. She's too full. I'm assuming that you have a backlog of people as well. However, you can follow her content. She does do lives, and she does put out a lot of content on TikTok as well. And are you on Instagram as well?
I am.
Okay.
I'm not as good about Instagram.
Okay.
Staying on top of that, I'm trying. And I'm also working on finding a platform and doing some psychoeducation around trauma-informed parenting, and that idea of how to become that parent that's a buffer for stress. Some education classes or something around, to put my trauma-informed parenting class on a platform and teach it. It's an 8-9 week course, and then also creating how to be a buffer for stress for your kiddos or something like that, a course as well, but I'm not there yet.
And so you can find her on TikTok. Obviously she just mentioned she's on. So if you can give people your TikTok handle so they can follow you, and just because you're on TikTok following her doesn't mean that you have to do dances yourself. So if you don't have a TikTok, just go ahead and grab one and follow her, follow me, so you're not missing out. But go ahead and give them the ways to reach out to you.
Sure. It's Hezzy Helps. So it's H_E_Z_Y_helps.
Thank you all for joining us. This is Heather Thompson out of Colorado Springs, licensed professional counselor. This was Toxic to Triumph. My name is Matthew Pfeiffer, your host, and I will talk to you soon.